Everyone, and welcome back to another review video for test 3. In this video, we're just going to be covering virtue theory or Aristotelianism, the Aristotelian account of the good life. Let's obviously call it virtue theory. So, Aristotle begins by presenting a theory of value. So, we saw something similar with the hedonist, but Aristotle's is slightly different. So, where we might agree with the hedonist, beginning with instrumental things that are instrumentally desirable. They're desirable for the sake of something else. So, for example, and this definition is, of course, familiar, so don't overthink it, but one example is just, I desire to know biology to get an A on my biology test, something like that. And then, similar to hedonism, there are things that are intrinsically desirable for its own sake. Hedonism believes that the only intrinsically desirable thing is pleasure. The only intrinsically bad or undesirable thing is pain. Aristotle disagrees with that. And this is also where the similarities to hedonism kind of end. So Aristotle goes on to say that there's something beyond this, beyond intrinsic, and that is the final end. So these are like the intrinsic ends, and then this is the final end. Something that is desirable for its own sake, so intrinsically desirable, and not desirable for the sake of anything else. So Aristotle believes that there's only one thing that falls into this category that can describe this, the final end, and that is eudaimonia, or flourishing, or happiness. Eudaimonia is a Greek word. Flourishing is a pretty good translation, like human flourishing, what it means to flourish as a human. Happiness is the term used in your reading, although it's maybe not the best translation. It's not particularly super important for your guys' terms, but just so you know. So these get more desirable as you go on. So the most desirable thing, the final end, is something that is desirable for its own sake and not for the sake of anything else. It is not instrumental. So one important difference between virtue theory and hedonism is, in virtue theory, things can be, and he specifically accounts for things that are intrinsically and instrumentally desirable. So things fall into this category, plenty of things for Aristotle fall into this category of intrinsically desirable, but they also fall into the category of instrumentally desirable. So for him, like knowledge, so for example, knowledge can be instrumentally desirable because maybe I desire to know biology to get an A on my biology test, as I said before. Maybe I also find knowledge of biology specifically, or knowledge in general, desirable for its own sake. So it's both. As is the case for pleasure and plenty of other things, honor, and basically any virtue, health. Plenty of things fall into this category, but these are different from the final end because they're both. They're intrinsically valuable, but they're also instrumentally valuable. And what's the most desirable thing is something that is not desirable for the sake of anything else. For Aristotle, that's eudaimonia. So we're still left with the question, you may still ask, but what does the eudaimonic life look like? What does eudaimonia look like in a human life? So this is virtue theory. You could think of it broadly. Virtue theory, the good life is the morally virtuous life. This is their theory of the good life. This is their theory of the eudaimonic life. That's another way to think of it. Answering the question of what is the good life. And moral virtues include, this is not a comprehensive list again, some pretty obvious things to include in the beginning. Generosity, that's a moral virtue. Honesty, bravery, self-control, justice, or fairness. Those are just some examples of moral virtues, and those would be categorized as moral virtues according to Aristotle. However, there's still a question, well, those are some examples of moral virtues, but how do we define a moral virtue? And virtue theory is going to define a moral virtue as a disposition or habit to, first, have the right feelings or the right emotions or desires, and to act accordingly to those feelings or desires. So You might be you might feel compassion, you might feel the need to help people when they're less fortunate than you and when you can help them, to give some money to a homeless person, for example. But if you don't act accordingly to that feeling, there's still something missing for Aristotle. So that's why this is kind of twofold, to have the right feelings and to actually act accordingly to those. But then there's still another question. What are the right feelings and what makes them right? So Aristotle presents this, it's called the doctrine of the mean, and it's not perfectly applicable in all cases, but it's a good starting point, it's a good rule of thumb, and you can actually figure a lot about what the correct feelings are by using this alone. So the doctrine of the mean broadly is just to define the right feeling is the mean between two extremes, and the two extremes are deficiency and excess. So we went over an example in class. When faced with fear, there's the vice of deficiency or lack of fear, and that would be recklessness. And then there's the vice of excess, and that would be cowardice. And then the virtue would be courage in the middle. Just to give you a few other examples, you don't need to know these, but just so you can kind of see it play out a little bit more. When presented with the opportunity to help, maybe, the lack of any sort of inclination or desire to help when you can, that's selfishness. Refusing to give up any money, any time, anything that you do for yourself, to help someone else when you can, that would be selfish. However, on the other side, there's the vice of excess. So it's hard to phrase this in a way that conveys that it's a vice and it's a negative thing. So you could call it altruism, and maybe something with a more evidently negative connotation, that's the moral saint. So someone who gives constantly, and in fact gives too much. That's kind of what we define as the moral saint, whose every action is dedicated to being as moral as possible, whether it's rationally because they believe they have to out of obligation, or they're the loving moral saint who does it, who derives their happiness in that way. Either way, you're giving up too much. You're and at that point you're ceasing to be generous. So you're something kind of beyond generous, but something that's not even good at that point. Generosity is a virtue, it's a good thing. And if you go too far, you give too much, then maybe you're a moral saint or an altruist or whatever you want to call it. So generosity is the virtue in the middle of these. And this is, I mean, you can see why this is very appealing, and this can kind of help us make a lot of sense of Susan Wolf's argument about moral saints, because it explains, it's kind of harmonizing the good life and the moral life. It's harmonizing your moral obligations with what is good for you. And you don't really need to think of it like that, but that is one way to think about it. And that's one way it can actually account very well for Susan Wolf's argument about moral saints, to say it would agree, yes, that's a bad thing, and it's because it's in excess, it's the vice of excess. And still, you do still have some sort of, not obligation, because we do discuss Aristotle doesn't use the word obligation, but you should still be generous. And you shouldn't be a moral saint, but you still should have the virtue of generosity. So, and then in fact, if you're convinced by the moral saints argument and you're like, oh, actually I'm not going to give anything at all, then you're going the opposite direction and you're still committing to a vice, and that's a vice of selfishness. So you might see how this is really appealing and actually kind of makes sense of a lot of things that we've found out that we believe throughout this class. And one of them is that being a moral saint is bad, but still that doesn't mean you should be entirely selfish. You should aim for the virtue in the middle, and that is generosity. So another example. So maybe when faced with the idea of consumption, you could choose not to consume at all, and that would be deprivation. Some religions might do this for certain purposes. You call it asceticism. you don't need to know this, but depriving yourself of, essential water, food intake, things like that. And then on the excess, there's gluttony or overconsumption, consuming too much, indulging too much, overindulgence. And the virtue in the middle is self-control. So it's not overindulging, it's kind of just indulging just the right amount. And then on the other end, and deprivation is also a bad thing, it's still a vice. So, and how do you, there's still the question. I mean, we've done it with a few examples here, but how do you determine in all cases what the mean is? Well, you use your reason generally. You use your reason to determine, and you can think about this more with examples on your own. In fact, I would encourage you to do that. Humans use this kind of scale, and maybe you use it pretty intuitively already, and they use their reason to figure out what the virtue is between these two extremes. So Aristotle, maybe even more famous, is called the function argument. This is Aristotle's function argument. So even with all this laid out, we still have the question, why should we accept the virtue theory of the good life? And the function argument does a good job laying out its core argument, I guess. So the first premise is the good human life is one that excellently fulfills the characteristic human function. So let me move this up so you can see. So this kind of defers to the function dependence claim. Function dependence is the idea that what is good or bad for something of kind K or of any kind depends on the characteristic function of kind K. So what is the characteristic function of a chair? To be sat upon. And anything that is part of a chair, it exists as a chair. It's called a chair insofar as it fulfills the function of being sat on. And it's a better or worse chair depending on how well it fulfills the function of being sat on. So, I mean, it's kind of weird to think about in this way, but you could just think of it. It's weird to think about chair excellence, but you can think about, a good or a bad chair, a chair that's better than the other. A chair that's maybe a little wobbly isn't maybe an excellent chair. A chair that's very comfortable, very stable, that's maybe an excellent chair. So it fulfills the quality of being sat on excellently, or it does it very well. Again, it's kind of weird to think about, but it makes more sense when you think about it for humans or for even other animals. So whatever the characteristic function of anything is, so in this case, the kind of humans, or humans as a kind, whatever the characteristic function of that kind or of humans, the good life, as opposed to just the human life, the good human life is doing that excellently. So the human life is doing it, period. To be a human, you do it, period. That's the characteristic function of being human. But the good human life is to do it excellently. And then the second premise, the characteristic human function is action or activity involving reason. So Aristotle only presents 3 possibilities as to what he thinks. You can think of him as just thinking, what is the characteristic function of human? Well, maybe it's biological life, to sustain life, to be alive, and to maybe thrive. But then you ask, is that the characteristic function of humans? No, it can't be, because trees, plants share it. Other animals share it as well. Other non-human animals share it too. So it's not characteristic of humans. It's not unique to humans. So he says, another possibility is sense perception or sensation. Maybe the characteristic function of human is to sense well, to achieve sensation appropriately, correctly. But that cannot be the characteristic function of humans because it's shared with non-human animals. So dogs, cats, pigs, orcas, they all sense as well. So it is not unique to humans. However, action, where's it at? Action involving reason, that is unique to humans. At the very least, and there's a good question that came up in class, there are other reasonable creatures, that's for sure. Orcas, that's the example that came up in class. Orcas are very intelligent. Many other animals are too. But there is still and maybe you think Aristotle can't account for that, but you could still defend that and defend Aristotle. Maybe have an updated version of this that makes it a bit more clear. Yes, it's true that other animals are reasonable, but they're not reasonable in the same way that humans are reasonable. In other words, when we talk about human reason, we're talking about something that's pretty particular to humans, whatever that is. And it's kind of hard to say. If you try to pick out any one thing specifically, like language, you might still have some counterexamples, like other animals that have language. So maybe it's not something specific, but we can observe some kind of difference between even the most intelligent, reasonable animal and human reason. So you don't really need to know that specifically. That's just one way to think of it. There are more advanced ways of accounting for that, actually. You don't need to know any of them. But this is how Aristotle defends this, and it seems face value pretty plausible. That human reason is unique to humans, or reason in the way that we do it is unique to humans. And so what we get from these two premises that results in, therefore, the good human life is one of excellent action involving reason. So to be a human is to perform this function, but to live the good human life, or be a good human, is excellence in action involving reason. And that just follows from these first two premises. The fourth premise, the life of excellent action involving reason is a morally virtuous life. So we didn't give a super concrete defense of this. One way to just think of why we say this, or why virtue theory includes this premise, is, well, using reason gets you to the virtuous mean. When we use a doctrine of the mean, we kind of remember how to figure out what the virtue in the middle is, we use reason. That was Aristotle's, that's what Aristotle told us to do. And someone who reasons excellently will end up in that virtuous mean, if that makes sense. So the life spent developing action according to reason, trying to reason the best as you possibly can and achieve that virtuous mean, and do it excellently, is kind of equivalent to the life spent trying to become morally virtuous. Do you see how those kind of collapse into each other in a way? Maybe not collapse into each other, but they go hand in hand. So by being reasonable and by using reason excellently, you're achieving the morally virtuous life, because you're using your rationality to figure out the right feelings, have those right feelings, and act according to them. So if you're confused about that, maybe think through it yourself. It's not super complicated, but it's not as explicit, but it's not super hard. So try not to overthink it. Just, they go hand in hand, basically. One is going to land you at the other. And that's just, I guess, one way to think about it. And then that gets you to the conclusion, therefore, the good life is the morally virtuous life, which is the conclusion of the function argument for virtue theory. So do you see how, we mentioned this, we talked about this in class, this harmonizes the moral life with the well-lived life by using the doctrine of the mean. And then it also creates this, I would say, honestly pretty intuitive argument. You can disagree with this, that's totally fine. A few people had issues with this second premise, FA2, and that's totally okay. You can think it totally fails. That's please go ahead. I would refer you to all the scholarship to this day going on about it, but it presents a pretty intuitive argument for how that the good life for humans that is very particular to humans, that accounts for a well-lived life and for morality and being moral towards others. Um, that's one way to think about it, and I think a lot of people are drawn to this argument. It's okay. Again, it's okay if you're not. um, but yeah, I think that's it for virtue theory, this presentation on virtue theory. I hope this was helpful. If you guys have any further questions, feel free to reach out to me. And yeah, thank you for watching.